So good afternoon. My name is Mike Niehaus. I'm a Director of Product Marketing on the Windows team out of Redmond. And in this session, we're going to talk about modernizing Windows 10 deployments. When we had originally submitted this session, way back when, we hadn't yet announced what the feature would be called. So you may have noticed the title differs a little bit from what was listed, because we had originally published a placeholder to say deployment with modern tools, with new Windows tools. Well, now we can say what those new Windows tools are. Those new Windows tools are Windows AUTOPILOT, where we wanted to enable these scenarios to be able to take a new device out of the box and transform it into something that could be used in an enterprise space. It's useful, before we get too deep into that, to kind of establish a background of how we got to this position. We've been looking at the way people are using Windows devices in IT, well, always, and we've noticed over the past few years that it's starting to change. As organizations have looked at how they're using other types of devices, they're now coming back to Windows devices and saying, well, maybe we can do things differently. Because we've been using other platforms, we've been using iPads and Android devices and things like that. But they treat those differently. They do the management of those devices in a much different way than they've managed Windows devices. The mechanisms that companies have used to manage Windows devices has been built up over the last 20 years and hasn't really changed that much in the last 10 years. People are still using Active Directory, still using group policy, still using System Center Configuration Manager, which gives you a full set of capabilities to control the environment. But do you need that? That becomes the question. If you're able to do management of those other platforms without all of those capabilities, do you need that for Windows? So it started discussions around this idea of modern IT. What does modern IT look like? And how is it different than the way people have traditionally used Windows devices? Obviously, multiple device platforms play into this. Personally owned devices plays into it. Lots of cloud activities play into this. So we've definitely seen this migration. We initially thought of this as kind of a separation by function, that maybe there were some groups of employees where you might be better off doing a modern style of managing these devices. The road warriors, the salespeople, the people who weren't typically in a corporate office, we could treat those in one way, and then the traditional PCs that were being used on a person's desk where they come into the office every day, they're always connected to the corporate network, we can treat those differently. I mean, that was the initial thinking, that we could split it. This group, one way. This group, a different way. But we started to evolve that thinking to think, well, maybe it's really a combination of those two that makes more sense. That we can do more of a horizontal separation and say that some functions are performed using a modern technique while other functions are performed using standard management tools. So imagine a co-management scenario where you have Intune managing settings and Config Manager deploying software. You start to get into all kinds of interesting combinations of how you manage these devices. Not only that, it gives you the ability to think about, how do I move function by function from the current way I manage devices into the cloud? That whole line of thinking we've wrapped into a concept called the Microsoft 365 powered device. And from the least marketing way of describing that as possible, we would describe Microsoft 365 powered device as a device running Windows 10 Enterprise, using Office 365 PROPLUS, and managed using EMS. That's the suite. We can then keep that always up to date using Windows as a service and techniques like that. we can keep it secure, we can keep it well managed. When we break that down a little bit further, we would look at the Microsoft 365 powered device in a few different categories. We would look at security as being the most important piece, because that's what organizations want, that's what they expect. They want a secure platform. They want it to be easy to deploy and manage, so we want to do what we can to try to simplify that overall. They want it always to be up to date, so that you don't have to keep doing these big deployment projects every few years. And the last one is kind of a new way of looking at how do you keep the environment healthy. We want to be able to proactively take actions based on telemetry that we can gather from the devices. So we build the capabilities into the OS to be able to tell you when things aren't going right. And then using Windows analytics and tools like that, we can help you fix things, identify problems, resolve issues before anyone even picks up the phone and calls the help desk. I mean, those are the basic concepts for the Microsoft 365 powered device. We're going to focus on one of them in the session here today. We want to focus just on easy to deploy and manage. That's where Windows Autopilot comes in. That's where these modern technologies come in. So we're still talking about Windows 10 Enterprise and Office 365 Pro Plus, leveraging Intune for management, leveraging the Microsoft Store for Business in ways that we'll take a look at in a little bit, and tying that into Azure Active Directory for authentication. When we look at deployment overall, we kind of need to break it down a little bit more than that before we get any deeper into this conversation. First, we need to be able to look at how do we deploy new devices. How do we take a device that you buy from an OEM, a distributor, a reseller, whoever, and get that ready to be an enterprise device? Traditionally, you've done that by bringing the new device in and then wiping it clean and laying a new image on it. But we think that there's an easier and cheaper way of doing that. So we'll talk more about that. But that's focused on new devices. It's also worth thinking about how do we manage existing devices? Because you probably have a lot of devices out there running Windows 7 that you need to get to Windows 10 prior to January of 2020 when Windows 7 end of life hits. So you need to be looking at that mechanism as well. We all know how to do the traditional deployment. We've been doing those traditional deployments for years, using images, using MDT, using Config Manager OSD. And those are still around and can still be used. And a lot of companies might look at that and say, yeah, that's the most appropriate way for us to move from Windows 7 to Windows 10. But we hope that you would be able to consider doing in-place upgrades to get from Windows 7 to Windows 10, because that's the simplest way of doing it. Automatically preserving all the apps, all the data, all the settings from your current machines, and taking them to Windows 10 with setup doing all the work. So easy deployment for new machines using Autopilot, in-place upgrade wherever possible, and traditional deployment if you've got other extenuating circumstances. Like maybe you want to change from x86 to x64. You can't do that via an in-place upgrade. Therefore, you have to do a traditional wipe and load deployment. Maybe you want to move from a third-party disk encryption product to BitLocker. Decrypting the disk, deploying a new OS, re-encrypting the disk. It's easier to just do a wipe and load deployment on those scenarios as well. So there are definitely scenarios that will push you toward a wipe and load, but hopefully in-place upgrade can be used for a significant number of the machines. In this session, we're going to focus primarily on the easy deployment scenario, since we are a little limited on time with an hour-long session, but we can follow up on those others through other forums. So if we look at the traditional way of deploying a new device, you probably would have a fixed list of device types, different models of machines that you support in your environment. You would build an image to deploy to those devices. You would gather up all the drivers necessary for each of those models. You would make sure that you have all of the apps ready to be installed either on top of that image or as part of that image. And then you build up a process around that to actually make that happen. That is certainly doable, but if you do that, it's costing a lot of time and money to create the image, to gather the drivers, to really build that process to make this whole thing work. So instead, we want to move to a process where we can take the device out of the box, plug it in, turn it on, connect it to the network, type in a user ID and password, and let the rest of the process be driven by the management tool. Push the remaining configuration down to the device, transforming it into something that's ready for the end user. If we do that well enough, IT doesn't even have to touch this device. You could have the device shipped directly from the reseller or distributor to the end user with hopefully no more than a half page of instructions that basically say exactly that. Get the device out of the box, plug it in, turn it on, connect it to a Wi-Fi network, put in your user ID and password, and sit back and watch. Everything else will be pushed down to the device by the management tool. So we do that using AUTOPILOT, where AUTOPILOT is essentially a collection of technologies. The one that we would want to focus most on is the cloud-driven scenario, because that's the one that gives you the most benefits. That's the one that enables you to ship that device directly to the end user. There are other scenarios as well, but the cloud-driven one is going to be the biggest focus. For the cloud-driven one, we register the devices in the cloud to say that they belong to your organization. So when those devices are first turned on and they connect into the internet, they say, oh yeah, I know what this device is. It belongs to this organization. It should have this experience. We do also have provisioning packages using the Windows Configuration Designer to quickly do bulk provisioning of a device. But that's an IT-driven scenario. That's not an end-user-driven scenario. So make sure you keep those separate. Don't think you're using Configuration Designer to create provisioning packages that you're then going to deploy through the cloud. No, that's not the way it works. Provisioning packages are just enough to bootstrap the device into a management solution, and then the management solution should take over. This cloud-based scenario is designed to avoid having to do anything but connect the device to the cloud, enroll it in Azure AD, enroll it in Intune, and have the rest pushed down. We also have a variation on that IT-driven scenario specifically for schools. Instead of using the Windows Configuration Designer, you can use the SET UP SCHOOL PCs app. Same basic idea. Walk through a simple wizard, choosing your domain names, your computer naming patterns, the apps that you want to install, those pieces of information. Building a provisioning package containing that information, which you can then put on a USB key and take it from machine to machine. So let's focus in more on that cloud-driven scenario, that golden path that we want to achieve. IT doesn't need to touch the device because we can make the process simple enough for the end user to do themselves. If it's too hard, it doesn't matter that we can ship the device directly to them. If you had to have a 15-page instruction manual that goes along with it, there's no way they'll ever do it successfully. So it's all about simplification. We don't want them to have to answer all the normal questions that you get when Windows first starts up. We want to suppress those. We want to automate the responses to most of those so that it's easy. We can integrate that into the supply chain so that when you buy these devices, they can be automatically registered to your organization, so you don't even need to take that step. The OEM or the reseller can do that for you. In order to make this work, we have the AUTOPILOT deployment service running in the cloud. Basically a big database that says, this computer belongs to this organization. this computer has this set of settings, this profile of settings that should be applied when the machine is started up for the first time. That then ties into Azure Active Directory to enroll the device as part of your organization, into Intune to manage the device, and into Office 365 PROPLUS, because we want to be able to get Office onto this device easily and configure it as well. So the steps necessary to do this are to register the device with the AUTOPILOT service, assign a profile of settings to that device to say how it should behave when it first starts up, and then ship the device to the user. The rest is designed to be easy. If we look at the basic flow, we have IT kind of sitting in the middle. We have the hardware vendor, which could be a reseller, distributor, OEM, doesn't matter, just depends on how you order your devices. And we've got the end user, who eventually we want to get the PC to. At the time the devices are manufactured, there's a hardware ID generated. As part of the manufacturing process, a hardware ID is established. The OEM or the reseller can send you a spreadsheet containing those hardware IDs. Or if they don't know how to do that yet because they're still ramping up on this process, or even if you just wanted to try this out yourself, you can take existing devices, boot them up, run a script, and gather the hardware IDs off of them yourself. Either way, now that you have those hardware IDs, you can upload those into the Windows AUTOPILOT deployment service. Once those are uploaded, you can then configure a profile of settings for each of those devices, saying how it should behave. And at that point, you're ready to ship the device to the end user. Now, the idea here is that you've already done the necessary work in Intune to specify the software that should be pushed down, the settings that should be applied, and all that good stuff. So it's really Intune then that takes over the process and fully sets up the device. Eventually, we want to get you out of the middle by having the hardware vendor define the device directly. So then they don't have to send you device IDs in a spreadsheet. You don't have to upload them. They can take care of that for you. We're working through that with different hardware vendors. We announced several of them at Ignite a few weeks ago, including HP and Lenovo and Fujitsu and a few others that are now supporting this process. We've been doing trials with our own Surface devices. So you could buy a Surface device and the Surface team would make sure that it was automatically associated to your organization as part of the purchase process. So what does this actually look like? We should probably start from the client side and see what the client experience is. Not sure how many of you have taken a new computer out of the box recently running Windows 10 and walked through the whole setup process, but there are quite a few screens and quite a few questions that get asked as part of that process. So really the goal with AUTOPILOT is to simplify as much of that as possible. And if we have a new device and we start it up for the first time, it goes into the out-of-box experience, UBI. And the out-of-box experience will ask a few upfront questions that there's no good way to get around. We had to ask you for your location and your keyboard layout. We use the location primarily to filter the list of keyboards to make that easier. But after you've chosen the location and chosen the keyboard layout, and skipped the second keyboard layout because I've yet to see anyone who needs a second keyboard layout, we can then connect to the network. Now in this case, I was using a virtual machine to capture this, so my virtual machine didn't need to make an explicit network connection because it has a wired connection. But if it had a wireless connection, you would connect to that wireless network at this point in the process and even connect in through a captive portal in a coffee shop or hotel or wherever. At that point, now we need to authenticate with the organization. We get a customized experience showing our domain name. You put in your email address, you put in your password, now the device joins Azure Active Directory, enrolls in Intune, and signs the user on for the first time. During that first sign-in, you see the pulsing blue screen while the initial application installs are happening. At the same time, Intune in the background is starting to push policies down to the device. So what you didn't see were all the other things that would normally happen during UBI. You didn't see a privacy screen, a Cortana screen, a OEM device registration screen, a screen that asks you, is this a personal or a work device? One that says, do you want to join Active Directory or Azure Active Directory? All of those extra screens were automated by the profile of settings that we put in place. After we're signed in, we can see the apps that were pushed down, including Office and other applications. We can see a custom layout's been applied. We get a notification that OneDrive is set up and ready to go, so all of our data files are there as well. We can see that the end user doesn't have admin rights to the machine, because if it did, it would say that this user is an administrator. We can see that it's joined to Azure Active Directory, and that it's being managed by Intune, including all the different policies that have been applied to the device. Now, obviously, that's not a real-time process that I had to do some edits to get this down into a reasonable amount of time, but the goal is for this whole process to take somewhere between 30 and 90 minutes. I mean, it's really going to depend on how much software you want to push down to the device. The other thing is that the device was originally Windows 10 Pro, so we needed to make it Windows 10 Enterprise. So using Windows 10 subscription activation, another new feature that we just introduced, we automatically step the device up from Pro to Enterprise just by having the user sign into the device. So everything was fully configured as part of that process. The device is ready to go. Now the user has all their data, has all their apps, all the corporate settings have been applied. Off they go. That's the goal. We want this to be a process that's simple enough, easy enough for the end user to do themselves, but capable enough that it can do everything to the device that the enterprise wants. If we look at this, to break a couple of these pieces down, one of them was the Office install. One of the challenges that we initially had when we had devices managed by Intune is we didn't have a way to install Office, which was kind of ironic. But with Windows 10 1703, we added the ability to push Office from the cloud. Using Office 365 PROPLUS and Click to Run, we can define a simple app inside of Intune that gets Office onto the device. To set that up, you basically go into Intune and you create a new application. You can select an application type of Office 365 PROPLUS Suite and then specify the settings. Like, we want to be able to choose which applications we should install. So we could check all the different apps that we want to be pre-installed. We can then put in the description and the name for the package and choose other important details, like, do we want the 32-bit version or the 64-bit version? Do we want to be on the current channel, the deferred channel, or the first release for deferred channel? Now, those are the old names. If you saw the servicing session yesterday, we've changed the terms now to semi-annual channel targeted, and monthly channel. So Intune will be updating those shortly. But you choose how frequently you want to receive updates. And then you can take it the next step and specify what languages you want and other things to customize the installation. And then just deploy it. So you've got that app. Deploy it out to all your users, and AUTOPILOT, enrolling the device into Intune, will then install Office on the device through that process. So pretty easy to get Office onto the device. For your own line of business apps, you would add them into Intune in a similar way. You'd upload the installation files into Intune along with the command line to install it. There are some limitations in that with Intune today, in that it supports single file MSI installs as well as universal Windows app installs. So there are some some challenges around the types of applications that you can install, but generally there are workarounds available to try to get the different types of apps in place, and the Intune team's working on additional capabilities to make that even easier in the future. So I mentioned before that the Microsoft Store for Business has a role to play in this, and you might think initially that that's because we want apps from the store. And while there are certainly some scenarios where you want apps from the store, this isn't about apps. This is really about where do you define that list of devices to say these are my devices that belong to my organization with this profile of settings. So we use the Microsoft Store for Business to maintain that list of devices. So you can sign into the Store for Business, click on the Managed tab, and then go to Devices, and then upload your list of devices and assign a profile to them. So you upload the device IDs, configure the profile of settings, apply that profile to the devices, and it places those details into the AUTOPILOT deployment service. We're also working to add those same capabilities into Intune, so you can do that directly through the Intune console. If you're a partner, you can do the same thing through Partner Center as well. So there are multiple interfaces to interact with the AUTOPILOT deployment service, but all of them serve the same purpose: to upload the devices, to create profiles of settings, and to apply those profiles to the devices. OEMs, CSP partners, resellers, distributors, etc., they would all use the Partner Center. We're going to take a look at the Store for Business interface, but the others would look pretty much the same. Same basic idea, where we can first sign into the Microsoft Store for Business. Used to be called the Windows Store for Business, but it's expanded beyond just Windows stuff, so now it is the Microsoft Store. Once we've signed in, we can click on Manage, and then click on Devices. And once we get to the Devices screen, we can see a link to Add Devices. If we click on that link, it will browse for a CSV file containing the hardware details. We can upload that CSV file, placing the devices into a group, which is primarily just for organizational purposes. Once you've done that, you can then create a new deployment profile with the settings that you want to apply. And the settings here are pretty simple. Just by defining the device, we automatically skip Cortana, OneDrive, and OEM registration pages. We automatically assume it's a work machine, and we create a branded experience to show your custom icon and company name on the initial sign-in screen. We now have 3 other optional settings that you can configure. One, to skip the privacy settings, which few users would understand anyway, so most people turn that one on. There's another setting that was just added for Windows 10 1709 to skip the EULA so that the user doesn't have to click accept. And then the third one is to disable local admin account creation on the device, which is a horribly named setting because what it actually does is it prevents the user from getting admin rights to the box. So the user gets the device, they go through UBI, they type in their email address and password, they get signed into the device. Normally, since they had been the one who joined the device into Azure Active Directory, they would get admin rights. But if you don't want them to have admin rights, you can say, yeah, don't do that. Just make them a standard user on the device. So you create that profile. Once that profile is created, you select the machines you want it to apply to, and then choose to apply that profile to those machines. Once that's done, we can now see we've got a Surface Book defined. It has that non-admin profile assigned to it. When that user shows up, when it checks in with the AUTOPILOT deployment service, that group of settings will be sent down to the machine, and UBI will behave according to the settings that have been specified. So that's really all we use in the Microsoft Store for Business. We didn't look at any of the application pieces. Now, you could acquire apps through the store for business, synchronize those with Intune, and then push them down via Intune, but we're really just using the device maintenance pieces for AUTOPILOT. The rest is really a different conversation. So if you wanted to try this out yourself, you need to understand the prerequisites. First, you need to be running at least Windows 10 1703. It was added back in the April release when that came out. We do recommend that you install the July cumulative update onto the device because we fixed some bugs in the initial implementation, so that update takes care of those. You need Azure Active Directory Premium because it's actually Azure Active Directory that takes care of enrolling the device in Intune. And that automatic enrollment feature is an Azure Active Directory Premium feature. You need Intune or any other MDM service that can then take over and manage the device and push the configuration down to it. If you're going to use the Store for Business to maintain the list of devices, then you need to have a Microsoft Store for Business account. It's no big deal. You had to sign in with an Azure Active Directory tenant admin account once to accept the terms that get presented to you the first time you sign in. The tenant admin could then delegate access to other users in the organization so that they can then maintain the list of devices. And if you want to take advantage of that automatic step up to go from Windows 10 Pro automatically to Windows 10 Enterprise, you need to set up Windows 10 subscription activation. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. So then the question becomes, well, how do I get the hardware IDs from any existing machines to try this out with? The easiest way of doing that is to boot up a device running Windows 10 1703. Maybe that's a virtual machine. It's fine. So you boot it up. In the initial UBI screen where you choose the locale, say United States or Sweden or whatever, on that screen you can press Shift F10. That will open up a command prompt. Once you get to that command prompt, you can run a PowerShell script. That PowerShell script is published to the PowerShell gallery. You can actually even install it on the machine directly from the gallery as long as that machine has internet connectivity. Once you run the script, it creates a CSV file. You copy that CSV file off to some location, whether it's a USB key or a network share, and then upload that to the Store for Business as a new device where you can then apply a profile to the machine. Once you've done that, you can close the command prompt and continue through UBI. It will get to the point where it recognizes that, oh, okay, this machine is registered with the AUTOPILOT deployment service, and simplify the UBI flow for the rest of the process. We are working on a variety of improvements to this already, including some that have been integrated into Windows 10 1709, which came out last week. One of those is a progress display. That became one of the challenges that a user would get the device, they'd sign in for the first time, they'd put in their email address and password, but they'd never know when the process was actually done. So they click on the Start button and they would see, I don't have any apps yet. They'd check again 10, 15 minutes later, click on the Start button. Oh, okay, Office has shown up, but my other apps aren't there yet. So we've built a progress display that shows you all the security policies that are being applied, all of the network settings that are being applied, the apps being installed, all the certificates that are being pushed down to the device. So you can see that stuff is still going on. You can bypass it if you want. There's a Got It button where if you click that, it'll dismiss the progress display and the configuration will continue happening in the background. But if you really want to know when it's done, you can let that continue to run until the process completes. And then it'll tell you, everything's good, you're now set to go. The challenge with that one is you won't see it yet. So we built a feature into Windows that requires the MDM vendors to be able to tell Windows, how many policies are you going to push down anyway? Because otherwise, we have no idea. And presenting a Microsoft Progress UI that just says we're still doing stuff and we can't tell you how much more there is People would just make fun of that. So in that scenario where the MDM vendors haven't yet added support for this, you won't see this dialogue at all. So that'll show up at a later time when Intune, AirWatch, Mobile Iron, the other vendors get around to implementing that. The bypass EULA setting I already mentioned. That's new and available in Windows 10 1709. It should be showing up in the Store for Business very soon. It's actually in the Intune preview right now, which will show up early next month. We've also added a bunch of new MDM capabilities into Windows 10 1709 to help with this process, including a lot more security settings. So you can now take the security baselines that we publish and import all of those settings into Intune as well, so that you can apply those to the device as part of this configuration process. Beyond that, we're also working on adding support for Active Directory, because we know that there are a lot of organizations who want to be able to take this one step at a time. Remember those co-management scenarios that I mentioned initially. In order to support those, we want to be able to take a device, join it into Active Directory, then have it register itself with Azure Active Directory, which triggers the automatic MDM enrollment. So you get a device that's joined to Active Directory and MDM managed. You can actually take that another step with the new co-management features that the Intune and Config Manager teams have announced. So that when the device gets managed by Intune, the Intune agent, or the Intune MDM policy, gets pushed down to the device to install the Config Manager client on the device. So then you have an Active Directory joined device managed by Intune and Config Manager, where you can then pick and choose which functions are done by Intune, which functions are done by Config Manager. There is work that the Intune team needs to do to enable that, as well as the other MDM vendors, so you won't see that one quite yet, but it is something that's built into the OS now. The other vendors just need to add support for it. We're also adding the ability to specify a user on the device, mainly to customize the user experience. Like right now, if you had a device registered with AUTOPILOT, when you start it up, it will say, "Welcome to Contoso." If you had a user associated with it, we could customize that message to instead say, "Welcome Anna," "Welcome Michael," "Welcome whoever," so that you get that personalized experience from the first sign in to say that, yes, this is your device that you're setting up for the organization. We're also working on adding more settings to AUTOPILOT itself, into that profile of settings, because we've recognized the need to apply some policies to the device before the device is managed by Intune. Because there's a period of time in there where if these policies aren't applied before the first user signs in, they don't do a whole lot of good. A good example of that is the one to disable consumerization experiences. If you've read through some of my blogs, let's just call it the Candy Crush setting. If this setting isn't configured on the device before the user signs in, the Windows Store starts pushing apps down to the device. Well, today, Intune can't get that policy down to the device fast enough to prevent those apps from installing. So we're working on a mechanism to allow Intune, or an MDM service, to build a group of settings that can be provided to AUTOPILOT to be applied to the device before the device is actually enrolled in Intune. So it's kind of a pre-management step, using AUTOPILOT as the mechanism to get those management settings to the device early enough in the process to make everything work. We're also working on adding multi-factor authentication so that we can leverage, say, an authenticator app running on your phone. So rather than putting in the user ID and password, instead you just put in your user ID and it challenges you to type in the latest PIN that's been generated on your phone as an additional security step to make sure that you are who you say you are, that you belong to the organization that you're able to authenticate. The other thing that we're looking at is using AUTOPILOT as a mechanism to completely automate the device setup, or at least as completely as we can possibly get. We want the device to be turned on. Right now, you still have to click to choose the locale, choose the keyboard, skip the second keyboard, and connect to a wireless network. But after you've done that, it wouldn't ask any more questions at all. The device would be fully configured without putting in a user ID and password, without specifying anything else. Great for frontline workers, people in call centers and help desks and places like that, as well as kiosks, where you're going to set up a whole bunch of machines with exactly the same prescribed configuration. We don't need to figure out who the user is for that device. We have all the information that we need in Intune to push that down. So we're working on that as well. Now, I mentioned the other scenario of doing this by IT. So everything with AUTOPILOT in the cloud was all about shipping the device to the end user. In this case, for IT-driven scenarios, we want to be able to do it differently. So we can use the Windows Configuration Designer to build a provisioning package that can be used for bulk provisioning of the device, can be used for a variety of different things, but the hope is that IT is doing just enough work in these provisioning packages to get the device to the point where it's managed, and that the device can then be handed to the user or deployed for whatever purpose it's being created for. So we still want to avoid imaging. We still want to be able to take the operating system that's shipped on a new device and transform it into something that's ready to use, just not necessarily from a cloud-driven scenario, instead using provisioning packages that we can carry around on USB keys. We don't provide a deployment mechanism for provisioning packages. So we create tools to generate the provisioning packages, but you had to deploy them as IT. The simplest mechanism for doing that, put it on a USB key, insert it into the machine during UBI. On the first screen, hit the Windows key 5 times. It'll pop up a screen saying, please select a provisioning package. Okay? You can also kind of build this into a hybrid scenario where maybe you've got an MDT, image-based deployment process, and you want to embed a provisioning package into it. So we've added PowerShell commands to install provisioning packages and things like that. So there are ways of integrating it into more automated processes, but most of the time the customers that we've been working with who've been using this have been using this primarily with a USB key. Because you can take a key, quickly go from machine to machine, set up a room full of machines exactly the same way, get them to that point where they're managed, maybe installing the config manager client, security software, whatever necessary pieces are needed to get that machine to a managed, secured state, and then the management tool takes over after that. So if we look at the flow for Configuration Designer, you'll see a bunch of wizards, and these wizards really are designed for those simple scenarios that we had already talked about, where we want to be able to bootstrap the device to get it to a managed state. So the typical one that you would want to use is to provision desktop devices. You specify a provisioning package name, which doesn't really matter. You can specify a device naming pattern, in this case using the serial number from the device. We don't have to put in a product key because we're assuming the machine came pre-installed with Windows 10 Pro and is already activated using the built-in key. We can configure the device for shared use, which is the shared PC mode, which was added a couple of Windows 10 releases ago. That shared use mode optimizes the machine primarily for schools, to make sure that a new user signing into the machine can quickly be productive without the pulsing blue screen and the background install of apps. So great for schools, a little bit more questionable for other organizations because of some of the other things it does to the device, like turning off sleep, because we want the machine to stay active when it's sitting on a cart in a classroom overnight to make sure that it can install security patches overnight so that they don't get installed during the next school day. Because we don't want the student to be unproductive because they happen to pick up a machine that hadn't yet been rebooted for Patch Tuesday. We also have an option to remove pre-installed software. That becomes one of the challenges with autopilot scenarios in general. If you get a device from an OEM that has pre-installed software on it, like trial versions of antivirus software and trial versions of Office and things like that, they get in the way of that provisioning process. I mean, you can't necessarily push Office 365 down to a device if it's got another version of Office on it already. You can't easily uninstall, say, Symantec or McAfee or any other security software before you want to install your security software on the device. So we added this option as a way of cleaning all of that stuff off. So you create a provisioning package saying to remove the pre-installed software. When that gets installed, it does a full device reset. So rather than having to go in and go into settings and reset this PC and do that manually, we can automate that through a provisioning package. That reset will keep critical things like drivers and power profile settings and that kind of stuff, but it'll get rid of all of that extra software and get you back to a clean Windows install that you can then build on top of. We can specify that we want the device to connect to a Wi-Fi network, so we can put in the SSID and network connection details if we want. We can specify if we want the device to join Azure Active Directory, or just create a local admin account for me. If we do Active Directory, we had to put in an account that has the ability to join the device into the domain. If we choose Azure Active Directory, we have to get a bulk enrollment token, where the bulk enrollment token can be used to join any number of machines into Azure Active Directory. Anyone who has the provisioning package then can join a device into Azure Active Directory. So to get that bulk token, you click the button, you type in your user ID and your password for the Azure Active Directory account. After signing in, it generates the token and returns it back to the configuration designer. That token is good for a maximum of 30 days. So that provisioning package would need to be updated with a new token every 30 days if you're going to continue using it. So we don't want those tokens to have an unlimited lifetime, because anyone who ever managed to get a copy of that provisioning package would then be able to join your Azure AD. We can then add one or more applications to the provisioning package. And the capabilities here are rather crude. You can specify as many applications as you want, but each of those applications can have one file with the command line that says how to install that file. Most of your software probably isn't one file, so you have to do unnatural things to package it up into one file so that you can add it into the provisioning package and then run a command that extracts that one file and then installs whatever was actually included in that. So don't get carried away with this because of the limitations. It would be better to have the management tool push this software down still after the device has been set up. So this should be limited to just enough software to bootstrap the device. Let's get the security software installed, let's get the management agent installed, and we'll take care of everything else later. We're still trying to talk the engineering team into fixing this. I told them as soon as they fix this, I'll stop making fun of them in public. So they are seriously considering fixing this, so we'll hope that they can get to that with the next release. We can also add certificates, which might be necessary to get the machine connected to the Wi-Fi network or even to a wired network. But once you upload the certificates, they become part of the provisioning package and get applied to the machine automatically. After that, You can say that you want to create the provisioning package. It will put it into a folder on the machine. That's the file, the PPKG file, that you can put on the USB key and use to set up additional machines. Set up school PCs, again, exactly the same idea, where we want to be able to set up new devices for a school. The idea is the Set Up School PCs app should be even simpler and should be focused on those school scenarios. So in addition to asking about Active Directory domains or Azure AD, it will also say, hey, here's a list of education software. Pick the ones that you want to install, and we'll take care of installing those at the same time. So it's optimized for school scenarios and for teachers. So let's talk then about a couple of supporting features. One of those is subscription activation. I mentioned it before. The idea is simple. We want to be able to take a machine from Windows 10 Pro to Windows 10 Enterprise. So how do we do that? Well, we need to be able to get a license into Azure Active Directory for Windows 10 Enterprise. So we've created a process where you acquire these licenses and get them into Azure AD. Once those licenses are in Azure AD, then it's simple. You can just go into Azure AD and assign that license to a user or to a group of users, and then anytime that user signs into any Windows 10 Pro device that's joined into Active Directory or Azure Active Directory, it automatically steps up from Pro to Enterprise. This is available to all customers who have Windows 10 Enterprise E3, E5 subscriptions or Microsoft 365 Enterprise subscriptions, which used to be called the Secure Productive Enterprise subscription. If you have done this through an enterprise agreement, that's actually what was announced new back in July. Same with MPSA. The CSP one actually came a little earlier. So if you're a cloud solution provider, I think is what CSP stands for, that was available even earlier so that small and medium businesses could acquire a license for Windows 10 Enterprise E3 through CSP, and the same type of a step-up would apply. So what was new in July was the support for EA and MPSA. There are some steps that you need to go through to set this up. It's not that these licenses will just automatically show up in Azure AD, primarily because we don't know whose Azure AD belongs to which volume license enterprise agreement. So you have to make that tie between the two. In order for that to work, you need to place an order to Microsoft through your LAR, through your whoever you typically order Microsoft software from, for a $0 thing. So if you've got 1,000 users, you would purchase 1,000 $0 licenses. That 1,000 would generate a license token of sorts where the licensing admin for your organization would get an email saying, hey, we've got this new license, we need to associate it with an Azure AD tenant. So they have to process that. They will probably need some help with that, assuming that they're not the same person who's also the Azure Active Directory tenant admin. But once you go through those steps that are emailed to your licensing administrator, now you have Windows 10 Enterprise E3 and E5 licenses available in Azure Active Directory. So if you're used to doing this already for Office 365 or Azure Active Directory or really any of the EMS products, it's exactly the same process. You can go into the Azure portal or into the Office 365 portal and assign this Windows 10 Enterprise E3 license to as many users as you want, up to your license limit based on the number of $0 SKUs that you purchased. The end user then, again, just signs into the device. It can be an Azure Active Directory device, so joined to Azure AD directly. It could also be an Active Directory joined device as long as you have AAD Connect configured to synchronize your accounts between Active Directory and Azure Active Directory. When the user signs into an Active Directory machine, it would recognize that, oh, this is an Azure AD account, and the user has a license associated with it. Step me up to Enterprise. Today, this is for the Enterprise SKU only. We are working on trying to add this to education as well. So there are some additional things that we're working on for that. Another supporting feature, Windows 10 automatic redeployment. Not my favorite name in the world, but the idea is simple. We want to be able to take a device that's been used for a period of time and quickly reset it back to an initial state, but maintain some stuff. Don't completely reset it back to UBI, where you had to go through the normal setup process again. Remember the locale, the keyboard, the language selections. Remember that it was joined to Azure Active Directory. Remember that it was joined to Intune, managed by Intune. Keep track of the certificates, keep track of the Wi-Fi connections, but get rid of everything else. Get rid of the apps, get rid of the data, get rid of the users, get the device back to a managed state, but without any of that other garbage. Because at that point, we can then repurpose the device to be used for something else. This was designed, again, primarily for the school environment, because schools do this routinely. Imagine going through a school year, and at the end of the year, you want to get the device ready for the next school year. Well, schools today often spend the entire summer re-imaging every device to get them ready for the next school year. Instead, how about you just walk from machine to machine, hit the magic keystroke, Windows Control R, type in an ID and password, and then walk on to the next machine. So you could go through an entire school and get all the machines reset in a couple of days. Then you had the rest of the summer off to focus on other stuff. I mean, that's the idea. We want the process to be simple to initiate as you go from machine to machine. It does take 20 to 30 minutes to happen because it's going to go through a full reset of the OS. But at the end of that process, the device is still managed, and the reconfiguration can be done by pushing Intune policies down to the device. That does require Windows 10 1709 or later, so that's new in the Fall Creators Update. There is a policy that needs to be configured on the device to turn it on. We've documented that in the automatic redeployment docs. Today, it only supports Azure Active Directory, so it doesn't support Active Directory joined machines. We'll get that fixed in the next release when it comes out. And it requires thinking about administrators a little differently, because it's not administrators in the traditional sense. It's really any user who can add a device to Azure AD is considered to have enough rights to initiate this process. So think about a school. You're not going to let students add devices to Azure AD. You're going to let teachers and IT admins in the school do that. So anyone who can do that can also reset the devices. We are working on initiating this remotely. So imagine using Intune to do this for a whole batch of machines. At that point, that administrator requirement goes away, and the policy need goes away, because you can just go into the admin console and say, do an automatic redeployment of these 50 machines or these 500 machines, and it will send out the signal to the machine to initiate the reset, but keep it in a managed state. And more importantly, for those of you who don't like clutter in Azure Active Directory or Intune, it retains the same device ID. Because as far as Intune and Azure AD go, it's still the same machine, because we preserved the certificates, the identities of the devices, the computer name, and everything else. So from an Intune and Azure AD perspective, it is still the same device. If we look at the process for that, we can see an existing machine is enrolled in Azure AD and managed by Intune. At that point, we can, At that point, we can Try to not click in the wrong place. We can lock the machine, get it back to the lock screen, or just sign out. Either way works. And from there, press the keystroke. The keystroke in this case, Windows Control R. Once you press that keystroke, it will ask then for credentials to reset the machine. You type in an appropriate admin account. In this case, I cheated and just used my tenant admin account. And it starts the reset process. You get a message on the screen saying redeploying Windows. It reboots. It gets back into the first run experience, but it already knows all the answers, so it doesn't stop. It just keeps going through the whole UBI process, completely automated, getting it back to a point where you can sign into the machine. So it does take 20 to 30 minutes. We don't have 20 to 30 minutes, so this is, again, time compressed. But in a few minutes, we'll see that it gets back to the point where you can sign into the device and see that it's still managed by Intune. Almost there. One more progress bar. %. Back to the sign-in screen. Saying success, Windows is set up and ready to go. At that point, we can sign back into the machine using any Azure AD account, which will go back through the first login experience, because as far as this machine's concerned, it is the first login over again. So you'll see the pulsing blue screen again, saying hi, getting everything ready. But after that process completes, we can launch the setting application and just confirm that this machine is still joined to Azure AD and still managed by Intune. Now, depending on how Intune's configured, what happens after that is going to depend on what policies are still targeting that machine. If you still have the same policies in place, the machine could be completely reconfigured exactly back to the way that it was before. So all you've really done is you've gotten rid of the users and the data that's on the device. It just depends on what policies are sitting there waiting to be sent to the machine. So we can go into settings. We can see that the machine is joined to Azure AD. And if we look in the information, we can see that it's still managed by Intune. And there are policies that have been deployed to the machine. And those apps have been pushed back down to the machine because my apps were targeting a user, Anna. In this case, when Anna signed back in, those apps got pushed right back down. Stop. Okay. In-place upgrade is, again, what we want to consider for Windows 7 to Windows 10, to let Windows do all the work, automatically migrating app settings, data, and drivers. It is supported through WSUS, so you can take existing Windows 7 machines and upgrade them from WSUS. You can do it with Config Manager using task sequences or servicing plans. You can do it using the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit, and most third-party management tools are able to do that as well. We have added some new tools to help with that, including MBR to GPT, so that you can change existing BIOS-based machines to UEFI, which is great to enable secure boot. We've added support for third-party disk encryption with the Reflect drivers command line switch. We've added the ability to sysprep an upgraded OS, so you could take your golden image, deploy it to a machine, upgrade it to a later Windows 10 build, re-sysprep it, recapture it. I don't recommend it, but it is possible now. We automatically suppress Shift F10 during the upgrade process, and there are some limitations that I mentioned before. Compatibility. We touched on this yesterday in the servicing session overall, but compatibility with Windows 10 is pretty good overall. We see 99% compatibility, which is what makes in-place upgrade possible. We still have IE 11 included in the OS, so that with enterprise mode enables you to make sure that all your web apps continue to work, which makes that process fairly smooth. We can help with the Ready for Windows site, which we took a look at yesterday. And we have Windows Analytics to help drive that upgrade process, to be able to tell you what known issues exist, what additional actions do you need to take for your existing machines before you can upgrade them. So it's helpful to drive that upgrade process for existing machines. On the traditional deployment side, just a couple of things to wrap up. We still release updated assessment and deployment kit releases with each Windows 10 release. Generally, there aren't any huge changes to those, just bug fixes and support for the latest OS. We always recommend that you use the latest one with the latest Windows 10 release. The BIOS to UEFI tool is included in the ADK because it will run in Windows PE. It will also run in Windows 10 1703 or above because it's built into the OS too. On the traditional deployment tool side, we continue to make enhancements to Config Manager OSD as well as the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit. Expect to see a new MDT release yet this year. It's currently being tested, primarily just bug fixes again. We want to make sure that we address customer feedback to keep things working well, but we're not adding any new features to MDT. With that, I'm all done. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions or feedback, find me up front afterwards. Thanks.